There it goes. Yeah. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to come here. I feel very privileged to take part in this very interesting conference. In this commentary, I address some challenges to global justice and equality in development of what is called a sustainable intensification of agriculture. And I try to address this issue according to the three questions that were raised under the topic for this session. A report published by the Royal Society UK in 2009 outlines the idea of a sustainable intensification of agriculture as part of a climate adaptation strategy to food security. A sustainable intensification of agriculture is here defined as an increase in crop production without expansion of land use and without causing adverse impact on the environment, including the atmosphere. Green biotechnology is mentioned in this context as having potentials to contribute to a sustainable intensification of agriculture, as it may be possible to develop, for example, GM crops that are specifically targeted to cope with some of the challenges that climate change pose to the efforts in ensuring global food security. The first step towards such a development is to ensure establishment of a global strategic research initiatives. In this context, the issue of justice refers to distribution of burdens and benefits in the very process of developing new knowledge and technology, so that the interests of socioeconomically disadvantaged populations, as well as concerns for the environment, are taken into account. But this task is complex and not straightforward. In discussion about climate adaptation, the principle of sustainable development is usually associated with a responsibility towards future generations based on the idea of intergenerational justice. The nature of such a responsibility and the issue of what constitutes justice in this context is, however, highly disputed. In this context of climate adaptation to ensure food security, however, we do not need to determine the extent of such a responsibility, because the current climate change patterns are predicted to have an impact on food production within a relatively short time span of 30 to 40 years. And thus it can be argued that it is ethical to ensure progress in agriculture and food production without having adverse impacts on the environment or the climate, because failing to do so may cause serious or irreversible harm to current generations and the environment. So the first two questions that were raised are, how should the benefits and burdens of sustainable development be distributed on a global scale? And what issues does this raise in terms of local and international governance? The issue of just distribution of cost and burdens of sustainable development can be closely tied to the discussion about ethical responsibility in relation to the problem of anthropogenic climate change. In this context, I refer to justice understood as distribution of public goods according to standard democratic principles. A line of argument similar to the one expressed in the polluter pays principle, which applies to environmental law, is used in the context of climate adaptation and mitigation and claims that the developed countries are to carry the main financial burden related to research into sustainable adaptation strategies. This argument for just distribution is, however, also disputable. If the developed countries are to be said to have a special responsibility to carry financial burden, this responsibility is not an absolute one. An alternative argument could instead be that the developed countries should take lead with respect to investment in new research and development of new technologies based on their economic capacity rather than because of their past contribution to global warming. It must be emphasized, though, that the need for food security and adaptation is a global one, and that there is a shared responsibility of all countries to take active part in the effort to ensure a global, sustainable intensification of agriculture. A global sustainable intensification of agriculture is to ensure open exchange of new knowledge and know-how. And here the problem of patent comes in again. It's been mentioned already several times, and I will mention it here again, because using patents to protect commercial interest in science and innovation cannot only create socioeconomic inequality, but it may also pose a potential threat to the process of developing a sustainable intensification of agriculture on a global scale. No single technological solution is available to ensure sustainability, and thus it is necessary to ensure that all possible models are explored and that new innovation can be shared. Ensuring adaptation strategies for food security that takes into account concerns about justice and equality in distribution of new science, know-how, and technology requires both local and international governance. One suggestion in this context has been to reserve public funds or funding from non-commercial organizations to ensure research into areas of agriculture management that can benefit vulnerable population groups and the environment overall. But other types of governance in this context could also include development of local and international ethical standards for environmentally sustainable production, which has to be followed by agriculture and food industry. Furthermore, it could also involve transfer of tax resources provided from crop and food industry into public research funds in order to ensure development in research areas which represents little or no commercial interest, but have the potential for benefits, especially for poor populations and the environment. And this leads to the third question raised. How do considerations of global justice and equality relate to specific ethical issues in relation to emerging technologies? The biggest challenge to a just and sustainable development within the context of agriculture and food production is perhaps that of cognitive barriers, here also included moral concerns about specific technologies that potentially can become unjustified barriers towards climate adaptation. For an adaptation strategy to become a success, it requires public support in terms of willingness to embrace local and global initiatives to adaptation. And this requires looking beyond personal or local interests when considering how a sustainable development in agriculture can best be established. Because failing to do so may lead to injustice among population groups or regions. Willingness to adapt also depends on whether the individual consumer is capable of translating his or her climate awareness into proactive behavior, and as part of this also whether he or she recognizes the need for adaptation globally and personally, so that it's not just people far away that needs to adapt. I do too. A number of cognitive barriers may stand in the way for this process. And these are barriers in the cognitive ability to understand the problem of climate change and combine changes in the climate with individual behavior. Some moral arguments that potentially can become barriers for a just, sustainable intensification of agriculture are arguments that maintain that some types of biotechnology, such as, for example, genetically modified crops, are incompatible with protection of the environment, because it is seen as a violation of an inherent value of ecosystems or species or biodiversity in general. Against such potential moral barriers, it must be emphasized that the current development in agriculture is environmentally unsustainable, let alone that it contributes to anthropogenic climate change. And therefore, if our goal is to secure development in food production as well as to protect the environment, including the atmosphere, from further damage, it would be unethical to refuse a research effort into exploring potentials for developing new GM crops or using existing ones in the effort towards sustainable intensification. That is, though, neither to say that we should give blank acceptance to introduction of any type of genetic engineering applied in agriculture, nor that we should put all research efforts into developing new GMOs. After all, no single solution to the problem of ensuring food security in an environmentally sustainable way is possible, and there may be many possible and perhaps less invasive methods to ensure sustainable solutions which should equally be explored. And here it includes ways to change consumer patterns, consumer behaviors with regard to food consumption, which is also something that was mentioned both yesterday and also earlier today. But given the extent of the problem of climate change and the urgency of establishing sustainability in agriculture and food production on a global scale, we ought to explore all relevant areas of science that has potential to contribute to a sustainable intensification of agriculture. And we ought to evaluate application of specific technologies on a case-by-case basis, rather than reject them beforehand. Failing to do so may potentially lead to further harm to the environment and the atmosphere. Individual consumer barriers towards specific climate adaptation strategies, such as application of GM crops and foods, represents a major challenge to global justice and sustainable development in the context of climate change, because they may limit the possibility for adaptation. When considering implementation of specific climate adaptation strategies and policies, it is therefore important not only to pay attention to cognitive and potential moral barriers, but also to explore the mechanisms behind them and consider ways to overcome them.